Rescue the Embassy mission for the Nintendo Entertainment System is a bit of a conundrum in the NES library. It is both an almost wholly unique game experience for the time, while also being very much representative of a common thread among games of that era. This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. First things first, the box says that Rescue the Embassy mission is a Kemco Seika game, which, at first glance, seems to explain the unique nature of the experience. Kemco Seika brought decidedly different games to the NES, from Deja Vu and Shadowgate to Ghost Lion and Superman. Hey, I said different, not good. However, starting up Rescue the Embassy mission shows that Kemco Seika was not actually responsible for the game. It was actually created by Infogrames. If that name sounds familiar, that's because we talked about Infogrames at length in the previous Weekend Rental video on Superman Shadow of Apocalypse. Since we've already gone into the most noteworthy parts of Infogrames' history in that video, we won't worry about it here. What is relevant to this discussion, however, is that Rescue the Embassy mission is actually a port of a computer game called Hostages, also made by Infogrames in 1988. That game was released for a series of computer platforms including the Amiga, Atari ST, BBC Micro and Acorn Electron, Commodore 64, MSX, and MS-DOS, before making its way over to the NES. This is important because pinpointing a release year for Rescue the Embassy mission is kind of difficult. Wikipedia puts the release in 1988, while both Moby Games and the Nintendo Wiki claim it came out in 1990. Despite this, the actual manual carries copyrights for 1989, so we're gonna go with that. What makes Rescue the Embassy mission so different from other NES games of the time, though? Despite sharing the neo-militarist bent of games like Contra, Commando, and even Metal Gear, an issue we'll swing back to in a little bit, Rescue the Embassy mission does not offer the same style of hyper-machismo action-focused gameplay. Instead, it is a game of caution, planning, and coordination. The basic premise is that terrorists have taken over an embassy. Which one? Where? Why? Don't worry about it, it's never mentioned. And after negotiations have apparently broken down, you and your elite counter-terrorist ops team are sent in to, pacify the situation. The game takes place in 3 stages. Not levels, stages. This is an important distinction. First, the player must get their 3 snipers into position surrounding the embassy. This is easier said than done because there are searchlights combing the area around the building, looking for exactly the kind of incursion you are currently attempting. How did the terrorists get large-scale searchlights? Again, don't worry about it, it's never mentioned. Anyway, the snipers can try to avoid the searchlights by hiding in cover, somersaulting, crawling, or just plain old running. If the snipers get spotted by the searchlights, the terrorists will open fire. If your sniper gets hit by a good or lucky shot, they go down, and stay down. There is no life bar. There is no ducking or jumping over bullets Contra style. There are no multiple lives. As with real life, a well-placed shot and your team member will be killed. After the snipers are in position, the incursion team will be dropped onto the roof via helicopter. From here, which of the other 2 stages, or I guess we could also call them phases, of the game comes next is up to the player, and the player can actually switch between them at will. If the snipers have been positioned without being gunned down, the player can take control of each of them and scan the windows of the building from their 3 different vantage points, looking for the silhouettes of enemy terrorists and firing when they have a shot. Yes, this is sniper rifle gameplay, a good 8 years before either GoldenEye or MDK popularized the mechanic. Admittedly, it's more rudimentary here than in either of those games, but it definitely does it first by a wide margin. This phase is not a disconnected minigame, separate from the other phases of the game either. The more enemies the player can take out via the positioned snipers, the fewer enemies they will face during the actual incursion into the building. This persistence is impressive and makes the sniping more than just a fancy set piece. The incursion into the building proper is probably the most ambitious part of the game, however. Each team member enters one at a time and moves through the building looking for terrorists to gun down and civilians to save. All of this is done from a first-person perspective. Wait. Is this a first-person shooter? Well, yes and no. Yeah, the player moves through the building from a first-person perspective, but this is not the smooth scrolling of something like Doom, Wolfenstein, or even the original Phantasy Star. Instead, it is essentially a slideshow as the player moves around the grid that is the building layout. The Golgo 13 game, The Moffat Conspiracy, would actually emulate this setup the next year when it came out. The civilians are all static sprites who just disappear once freed by the player, and the enemies don't have animations per se. When a terrorist moves into or out of the player's line of sight, they just blink into or out of view. This doesn't mean that this phase isn't tense though. Sure, when a terrorist is out of view, even in the same room, they can't hurt you, but as soon as they come into view, it becomes a quick draw situation where the player needs to shoot first or be taken down. This tension is heightened by the fact that the player can accidentally shoot the hostages, so just pulling the trigger on anyone who comes into view is not the best course of action. Here's the real problem with the incursion section of the game though. It's gated behind one of the most ridiculously finicky minigames ever. In order to get inside the building, the incursion team needs to rappel over the side and smash through one of the windows. Okay, fine, makes sense. In fact, that's kind of what the front of the box promises, and the game actually delivers on it. What doesn't make sense is that if the team member drops more than, say, 10 inches at a time, relatively speaking, they seem to just give up on life, let go of the rappelling rope, and fall to the pavement and their death. Because of this, the player has to very quickly tap up, almost immediately after tapping down to start the descent, meaning that you are inching your way down the building very slowly. In other words, it's a balancing act of constantly tapping down and then up on the D-pad repeatedly.
Been a little tappy. Tap, tap, taparoo.
Why is the rappelling this way? Real rappelling does not work like this. It is much faster, almost terrifyingly so. You'd figure that highly trained special ops members like this would be more capable. That the game treats it this way suggests that the person who made the game hadn't exactly done research on it. Oh, right. According to Wikipedia, the game was developed by just one person. Anyway, moving up. Actually, no. Let's stop and think about that for a moment. If the game was made by just one person, it offers a fairly clear window into that person's worldview. First, as mentioned earlier, the manual says that it has been 11 days since the initial terrorist action, and negotiations have broken down. But that's not the story the game's opening depicts. Looking at what the actual game shows, the terrorists move in, and immediately the counter-terrorist ops team moves in. There don't appear to be any actual negotiations taking place, just military action. Why aren't there any negotiations? In fact, why can't the player be the one to negotiate? It's not like there isn't enough space in the game. Despite there being multiple missions, each of them is just variations on the same thing. The street layout is the same, the embassy building is the same, the sniping is the same. The only things that change are the time limits, the number of enemies and hostages, and the number of searchlights. I mean, I kind of get it. If the player does particularly well negotiating, it's entirely possible the other stages of the game would be rendered unnecessary. Here's the thing though, there's a definite sense of satisfaction possible for the player in pulling something like that off, especially managing to do so without any casualties whatsoever. And the game does care about the player incurring casualties, as long as those casualties are hostages or part of the player's assault team. If the player loses any of their team members, either by getting shot outside the embassy or during the incursion phase, or if any hostages are harmed, even if the mission is otherwise successfully completed, the game scolds the player on the end screen. The terrorists are another story, however. There is only one way to deal with the terrorists, and it is unilateral. There are no non-lethal methods of neutralizing enemies. There are no flashbangs, there are no tasers, there are no gas grenades. There's only assault rifles or sniper rifles. Speaking of, let's go back to the sniper rifle segment for a moment. Okay, so the snipers can take enemies out from a distance, which makes the incursion stage of the game easier. Fine, great, we've already covered that. Taking a closer look at what the game expects of the player and how this scenario plays out for the player, there is an implicit encouragement of violence tied to the sniper's role. When scanning the windows as a sniper, the game encourages the player to shoot as soon as a silhouette appears in a window. The thing is, these silhouettes are indistinct. They kind of look like bathroom door signs, if we're being completely honest, and as is shown in the incursion stage, the hostages are roaming around the building. They aren't tied up or anything. Yet, despite this, the game tells the player that each silhouette is absolutely, without question, a terrorist. There is no possibility of mistaking a hostage for a terrorist. In other words, there is no questioning or moral ambiguity. The player is always right for pulling the trigger every time they take a shot and take down a silhouette. All of these factors, the absence of negotiating, the lack of non-lethal methods, the unquestioning acceptance of the moral stance of the authority figures, are part of a larger undercurrent not just in video games of the 80s, but of 80s pop culture in general. Douglas Kellner and Michael Ryan talk about this at length in their 1988 book, Camera Politica. They point out that, as a result of, and reaction to, America's devastating loss in Vietnam, American pop culture started becoming increasingly pro-military in the late 1970s, encapsulated by the success of Star Wars, which heavily featured World War II-inspired scenes and imagery, and offered a literal black-and-white moral stance. This push towards a hyper-masculine pro-military attitude peaked in the 1980s, particularly with the election of Ronald Reagan, whose Star Wars Defense Initiative bears the obvious pop culture influence in order to get the public on his side. Not only would the 1980s be the era of Rambo, Delta Force, Commando, Predator, Aliens, and Top Gun in movie theaters, but of selling that very militarism to kids. This happened in the form of those same R-rated movies getting children's cartoons, including Rambo and Chuck Norris and his Karate Commandos. Yes, those are real. No, I'm not making them up. Alongside other hyper-militarized shows like Transformers, Mask, and the revamp of G.I. Joe. That is also the reason for the existence of games like Commando, Choplifter, Contra, named after an actual American arms deal scandal by the way, Iron Tank, Russian Attack, again stay classy Konami, Ikari Warriors, Top Gun, Isolated Warrior, Metal Gear, despite Kojima's vocal anti-war stance, 1942, the list goes on and on. What does this have to do with a game that's ostensibly about a police action though? That's not the military, right? Well... Going hand in hand with this increased pro-military attitude is the militarization of the police. It can be seen in pop culture as early as 1975 with the TV show SWAT. Let's look at the opening of the show for a second. That opening emphasizes the assault rifles and sniper rifles the team carries, the body armor they wear as standard issue, and the fact that they ride around in an armored vehicle. In fact, this opening, aside from having a theme song that is still ridiculously catchy, seems to be a template of sorts for Rescue the Embassy mission. Anyway, this police militarization also intensified in the 80s with the so-called War on Drugs, where US Congress authorized the selling of surplus military equipment to local police forces. This situation led to movies like Cobra, RoboCop, although RoboCop is bitingly satirical about it, Tango and Cash, and Red Heat, and cartoons like Cops, where the heroes literally had the equipment grafted to them, Silverhawks, same deal, and, well, RoboCop, again, same deal, and with all of the satire stripped from it. It also led to games like Narc, which depicts the war on drugs as an actual war, and, well, Rescue the Embassy mission. Remember how I mentioned that if there were a negotiation stage and the player were successful with that, the rest of the game wouldn't happen? That idea just doesn't fit with the militaristic shoot first, ask questions later approach offered here. Tied to that, the terrorists are labeled simple political fanatics. There is no questioning or examination of exactly why this embassy was chosen, what the terrorists want, or whether there is any other way to resolve the situation. Again, it's just shoot first and maybe just don't ask questions. It's the difference between something like Dog Day Afternoon and, say, Lethal Weapon. This attitude didn't end with the 80s when it comes to video games. From the Sierra SWAT games starting in 1995, a subset of the Police Quest series, which by that point had acquired the endorsement of controversial former LAPD chief Daryl Gates, you know, he of the Rodney King LA riots fame, or infamy, to the first Tom Clancy endorsed video game, Rainbow Six. Wow, remember when a brand new video game company was founded just to produce Tom Clancy games? To modern games with Tom Clancy's name on them, such as The Division and Rainbow Six Siege. The hyper-militarization of video games, specifically police video games, has been present throughout, and all of them owe a debt to rescue the embassy mission. To be fair, there is definitely a certain appeal to the idea of carefully planning and executing an operation, ensuring no unintended casualties. Getting that congratulatory screen at the end of a scenario in Rescue the Embassy mission is undeniably satisfying. I'm not arguing with that whatsoever. It would just be nice if it were possible to get there without anyone being killed. There is a satisfaction in accomplishing that as well. You know how I mentioned earlier that all of the missions are pretty much the same, just with slightly different parameters? Having different negotiation scenarios would have gone a long way towards dealing with that. Different motivations, different reactions to negotiation tactics, and different negotiator-terrorist dynamics would have made the more military stuff after carry much different weight based on what came before. Rescue the Embassy mission offers an experience that is both 100% a product of the 80s, but at the same time moves beyond the simple testosterone-soaked run-and-gun nature of other games of the time. Its tactical approach to its concept offers more of a deliberately paced, cerebral take on the action game, just with uncomfortable undertones when one stops to think about them. It is still definitely worth a couple of playthroughs, each scenario has a time limit of 15 minutes or less, to experience a unique entry in the NES library, a snapshot of the prevailing attitudes and politics of the era, and the forebear of several modern gaming franchises. All of this adds up to make Rescue the Embassy mission a good weekend rental.
At last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have revenge.